Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. I'm Dr. Bob Weathers, and happy to be back with you and happy for you to join me. You notice I brought in a more handsome counterpart today. This is Odie Martinez. Thank you, Odie, for joining me. I've asked Odie to join me because, I've taught for, about 35 years or so, and the way that I teach is an interaction. I like dialogue, and I was talking to our co-producers, Austin Armstrong and Fran Salvatierra, and Odie earlier, was that what would it be like to bring in more of an interactive component on this end? I know if you're watching my previous podcast, I give exercises, and we do those each time we meet, and some of you respond, but I don't actually see you, and I don't engage with you like I would if I was in a class with you. One of the ironies is I was talking to Odie, I come to this podcast each week right from a group at Beginnings Treatment Center locally here. And I just came from a group, and I pilot this material with them. I'll take parts of the material. I don't really go through the entire podcast, but I'll pick parts of it. And the groups are so interactive. There's so much. It's the interaction where the material kind of comes alive. So we're trying an experiment. Odie's willing to join me. Thank you, Odie.
Yes, you're welcome.
To see if we can bring in a bit more of an interactive component. Now, having said that, Odie now and I would really appreciate you bringing questions, any comments. For clarification, whatever you have, bring those to us, please. I'm going to ask Odie to do the same with me in real time, and I may do that with you, Odie.
Sounds good.
The interaction really helps it come alive. I also want to mention one other thing, and there's an asterisk. This is to Austin Armstrong, is that in one of our recent podcasts, somebody viewed it and actually viewed several of them, and just today yesterday reached out to me to want to know if they could get help for their son, who's had issues with, struggled with addiction. They're from the Eastern Seaboard. I was able to connect them up with Dr. Ehsan Garajadagi, who is in charge of Therapy Cable, and we're all this podcast is under the rubric of Therapy Cable. I just talked to Dr. G before I left Beginnings today. He's made contact with this family, and they're going to be sending their son to get treatment here, which will include being in groups that I lead, as well as I'm part of the family program now at Beginnings. I'll be meeting with the families. I'll be actually meeting with the parents that I wrote to earlier today. Why I'm mentioning this is that if you're viewing this and you yourself have struggled with addiction, I want you to consider reaching out for help. And there's ways of doing that. You can reach out to Beginnings Treatment Center. You can reach out to my website. I'll give you the address at the tail end today. You can write a response that will be held confidentially and Ask an Addiction Specialist here on the Facebook group. In fact, when you share something online here, Odie knows this, I don't read your name unless you're Austin. I don't read your name out loud. I want to respect your confidentiality. This whole, if I have a passion around addiction and recovery, it's addressing the huge barriers to recovery that shame, personal shame, and societal stigma pose. And there's plenty of us that have relapsed and died as a function of being too ashamed to get help, or turning to substance in order to numb out from the shame. And so it's a pillar of my own commitment. And so I want to respect that here, realizing that there's a tremendous amount of social stigma around admitting that you're an addict. There's even social stigma about admitting that you're in recovery. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because if I'm in recovery, that means I was an addict, and that's never a compliment. And so I want to invite you as viewers, as participants, to engage with me today, engage with me and Odie. You can write, you can send comments through Ask an Addiction Specialist through the chat function. Austin will be good to publish those. I'll respond to you. I will not speak your name. If you want to reach out for personal referrals or support, you can do that through my website or through Beginnings Treatment Center, which is local. And we'll find a good place for you or your son or your daughter or your husband or your wife, whoever it happens to be. I also really want to speak to a broader audience than just those that are in addiction. We have clients that are fully into committed recovery, and this can be a way to kind of bone up on material and get booster sessions. I also know that we have a lot of loved ones of those in recovery, like the family I was just mentioning that are viewing this. And developing tools to be able to work with your loved one in and around their addictive behaviors. And then finally, we have those in our audience that are actually working in the field of recovery. We have therapists and other recovery-oriented workers that view this. And I'd love to hear from all of you. And in the spirit of having you here, Odie, if you all will interact with me, insofar as you do that, I will respond to every single interaction. Okay. I really invite that. I wish you'd just flood me with questions and get me to say, Uncle, stop, it's too much. That would be a nice problem to have. So
that's the goal for today then.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, and having you here, Odie, is, exactly, is to strip a bit more interaction.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So it's good to have you guys here, and it's good to have you here, Odie.
Good to be here.
Thank you. As a quick review, last week we talked about the psychological roots of addiction. We focused on shame, and just by way of review, we talked about shame as being two sides of a coin, either a threat to my being accepted socially, getting kicked out of a group, and the flip side of that is a threat to my self-esteem, which is feeling bad about myself. The number one trigger for relapse is stress in addiction. And the number one stressor for most individuals, this has been tallied by looking at the elevations in cortisol, which is the stress hormone. The number one elevator of cortisol is threats to social acceptance and threats to self-esteem, which is basically shame. And so there are many other factors that go into addiction, including the biological factors, familial factors, even societal factors. I'm not ignoring those. That's just not my specialty. My specialty is focusing on what can we do to manage, reduce, eliminate as much as possible shame and stigma around addiction, because they serve as barriers for people getting into help, and they also serve as triggers for relapse for those that got help. And so that's really our focus. So last week when we talked about the roots of addiction, this is where we focus. Okay. Today we're going to be talking about, I'm going to be introducing today the way out of shame, which is to say the way out of addiction. And we'll be introducing that. There's no magic bullet with this, and we'll make several passes through this, Odie. Okay. But today is a beginning pass through that. And we're going to start right away with some exercises to kind of get us in the field here. I'm going to suggest a couple of different things, strategies that I think can help reduce shame, hence provide more support for recovery. So we'll start with that. So last week we talked about shame as being a primary root of addiction. And our goal today is what can we do to silence shame? What can we do to silence shame? My view of it, Odie, is that shame is what silences us. Shame leads to a freeze response. If you think about the fight or flight response, we all know about the fight or flight response. Yeah. Neurobiologists now talk about a fight, flight, or freeze response. And so if you do something to scare me, I'll fight you, I'll run away, or I'll curl up in a ball. Shame is the curling up in a ball response. Gotcha. And so shame effectively paralyzes forward momentum. I don't move towards you, I don't move away from you, I curl up in a ball. And that works okay if I'm being attacked by a grizzly. What was that movie, Revenant? Yeah, where Leonardo DiCaprio, he curls up in a ball as he's being mauled. It's really painful to watch that. That's a freeze response. And why that works sometimes, I don't know how that worked for him, God bless him. I think how that works is that animals don't want to eat dead meat. So it's an evolutionarily designed response, is that if you're dead, you may be spoiled. And if you're spoiled, you may make me sick. So I won't eat you if you're dead. I'd rather you be fresh kill. Sorry to be so graphic about this. But the freeze response, if you think of playing possum, how a possum curls up, it's very adaptive in some circumstances. The problem is that around addiction and recovery, it stops us in our tracks, and shame is so vitally connected to addiction that it's hard not to be ashamed. So the question is, how do I shed shame? How do I silence shame? So that's really our topic today, and that's why I say that shame silences us. It shuts me down. I won't speak to you. In fact, when I ask clients, what do you experience when you experience shame? People will say things like, I look down, or I want to crawl into a corner. Do you have a sense of that for yourself?
Yeah, I was about to mention something. This has nothing to do with addiction, but
it doesn't have to. Okay. We're humans here. We're humans here. So, addicts are humans as well. But yeah, I want to broaden this beyond just a narrow niche of addiction. 25% of American adults are addicted to substance right now. That means 75% are not. Why don't we include? And I'm assuming that you're not. Let's talk to the other 75% as well today.
Well, I'll talk substance in it because food is one I
Yeah.
feel, but
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, the example I was going to use is I notice when I play a sport, specifically basketball.
Yep.
I notice that when I sometimes play in a league.
All right.
So I notice sometimes when the game is on the line, so to speak,
Yep.
and I go in and I tend to start thinking in my mind, oh well, what if I don't do that well? You know, what if I turn over the ball to the other team a bunch of times? I start performing poorly, pretty much. Like somebody passes me the ball, I start dribbling it, and the next thing I know, what I think in my mind is happening in reality. So
You're like
I
100%.
freeze up,
Yeah,
so.
you're 100. It's a perfect example. 100% more vulnerable. I played basketball all the way through high school, then I played City League, kind of like with you, all the way through adulthood, until my body finally gave out on me. It was a shoulder injury that put me out of City League basketball. But one of the things that was really vulnerable for me playing basketball, I loved basketball and I was good at it, and I bet you are too. But in a high stress moment, it gets dicey. And the worst for me, I wonder how this goes for you, the worst for me was free throws. It's like this free throw really matters. You're on the free throw line all by yourself. There's nobody defending, and you've got to shoot this ball just right to make the basket.
Right.
And there are times, I mean, on my own, I got to where I could make 90% of free throws on my own. I could almost do it in the dark.
Yeah.
In fact, I did it in the dark as a kid. I would just shoot. It was so much fun. I get out there, and why didn't I shoot 90% from the free throw line in a game? Is because I was scared badly. And I remember times, so embarrassing. There are times that I would actually shoot what was called an air ball.
Yep.
I'd shoot, and the ball wouldn't even make it to the rim. There's that, or it's even worse when you go up. I had a friend on my team. I still remember him. We called him Iron Hand. He would get up there, and owing to this, he would shoot the ball and shoot it just like a direct, boom! Basketball. It would hit the back or bounce off the rim. It was like a bullet.
Man.
And so that is the shame, or that's the fear response.
Okay.
Shame is really related to fear. It's mediated in the brain, and we just talked about it. It's fear of I'll let my team down in the context of basketball, or I will suck. You know, and that's a blow to self-esteem. And so I've always envied those players. I can think of them over the years. Michael Jordan is one that comes to mind, where he would play sick.
Yep.
You know, in finals, and you probably saw some.
Like it.
It was like, in fact, his playing was sick. In the second meaning of sick, is that he seemed impervious. And I also thought about this with Magic Johnson. Think of different players over the years in basketball. They would play, and it was almost like when things were more dicey,
they'd play amazing.
They play even better. And it's like, how do they get beyond that? That's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's. I always wondered that too. I watched videos too of interviews and how their mentality was, and I was like, oh, I'm going to try that, but it's never the same when you try it on your own.
Yeah. I love the analogy. Thank you, Odie. That's great. That's great. So what we're talking about is a human experience. It's not unique to addiction. It's particularly pointed in addiction. Because it's one thing to let down your teammates if you screw up a free throw or you drive and lose the ball. It's another thing to have everybody that loves you reject you because you're weak, defective, or broken.
Yeah.
In fact, I was thinking about it before I came today. It's not only having non-addicts judge you. In my case, it was having people that were addicted judge me. Because I was weak if I couldn't handle my alcohol, for example, to that group. And I was weak to those that weren't that group for having indulged as much alcohol as I drank. It's like you're just kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so in that sense, there's a vulnerability with addiction. And then societally, addiction is judged more harshly than virtually every other disease. In fact, I've mentioned it in previous podcasts, but a recent study of the World Health Organization that looked at diseases across the world, we talked about it in terms of the International Classification of Diseases, which lists every single disease you could ever imagine, from a hangnail to autism to AIDS to just think of all the diseases. And they rank ordered them, this is again cross-cultural, they rank ordered them in terms of social stigma. And guess what was at the very bottom? Well, you know, because we've talked about it, it was addictions. Addictions were at the very bottom, and it wasn't just in the U.S., it was across the world. There's an attribution. If I'm addicted, there's something really wrong with me.
Yeah.
And as I say, there's something wrong with me to those that themselves might be addicted, because I'm kind of spoiling their party, and there's definitely something wrong to the greater part of society, because one of the things that happens in addiction is that I look like I'm normal.
Right.
You and I can be talking, and I can just screw you over as a function of my addiction, and I'm not normal because addiction really knocks out the frontal cortex. And so I can actually keep talking to you, seem like I'm your friend, and do something very harmful to you. So it's particularly troubling because it's one of those things that disguises itself as normalcy, and I'm anything but normal. And so I can go out and get in my car and you think, oh, Bob's good to go, and then run over 3 people as a function of having been drunk or you know, having some other drug in my system.
Right.
And it's confusing and it's scary. And so it's understandable to me that people will judge it, but it's very painful for the addict because who wants to come out with being an addict in that environment? Or for that matter, who wants to be in recovery because there's such shame even attached to that. So.
Right, so yeah, that comes in hand with what you said about not being accepted.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. In fact, let's talk about that for a second. The next slide talks about a catch-22. Some of you will be aware of this term and some of you won't be, but let's just talk about it. I just introduced it today in the group, and some of the answers were, that's where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. That's what one person said over here. Another person over here said, it's like a double-edged sword, and I said, that's right. And so we talked about different examples of that. The technical definition, I think I got this out of like Webster or something. It's a dilemma in which there's no way out because of mutually conflicting options. I have no idea what that means. But we'll put that out there. Let's just talk about some examples of it, and it's tied into the example you just gave, Odie.
Okay.
If shame increases my vulnerability to drug using, and the research indicates this, is that if I found with alcohol or some other drug that it actually helps to numb out or to mellow out my shame, then my brain remembers that as that's a very powerful self-medication, Bob.
Right.
So if I'm interacting with you and shame comes up, the body via the dopamine circuitry is what is in the brain. Dopamine will kick up, which means red alert, and it leads to drug-seeking behavior. I'll relapse if I've been sober. I'll relapse, and then when I relapse, when I turn back to drugs, guess what the attending feeling is? Especially when I come out of being high, it'll be more shame.
Right.
And so you get this kind of vicious cycle. It's another way to think of a catch-22. You're really damned if you do and damned if you don't. You're damned with shame, and then if you try to resolve shame by way of, in this case, substance, you'll end up being damned by that choice as well. So it's kind of temporary relief in the short term, but long term it actually is a vicious cycle. And as I've talked about before, the poor get poorer. The more I try to manage my shame via substance or eating or some other addictive behavior, actually I'm going to lead to a greater increase in shame over time, which means greater risk for relapse. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I was going to ask does the shame increase as the cycle continues, or does it kind of just plateau and stay the same?
That's a good question. Let me just ponder that for a second. I'm going to say that it increases, and I'm going to say what I'm thinking with that, and others can chime in if you have thoughts about this. Let's say that you're my brother. Let's say that you're my son.
Okay.
Let's say, honestly, let's say you're my grandson. let's get real about this, okay? Whatever relationship we have.
Right.
We'll just say father-son for right now. And so you look up to me, and you know that I've been addicted to substance. You know I've been in recovery. And let's say I find out today that I've lost my job, and I come home and I'm despondent. And let's say that I bring home a whole bunch of, let's say just beers. Let's just say, as I start popping beers and drinking them.
Right.
Well, you've been with me through addiction. You've been with me with hopes and longings attached to my recovery.
Right.
I start drinking. It stands to reason that you're not going to be happy about that. And so there was the shame of the loss of my job. And now what I've got is I've got the loss of your support. And so that's when I think about it increasing, I think what relapse or using does is it opens us up to increasing threats to social acceptance. You're my son, you're not accepting me.
Right.
And also increases my lack of self-esteem because I must not be handling my loss of job very well, because the only way I can handle it is to get drunk. And so I think there's a vicious, in that sense, it's a vicious cycle. And I would argue what you're doing is you're increasing almost the touch points for shame.
Right.
And so I can feel pretty good about myself in recovery, and I can soon enough turn that right around and reverse that and be into deeper doo-doo than I was before. Does that make sense as a possible response?
Yeah. That's good.
I think one of the virtues of self-help programs, I'm thinking of the 12-step programs. I'm very involved in refuge recovery, which is a mindfulness-based recovery, smart recovery. There's a lot of resources that are available for people in recovery. Is that if I relapse, let's say now that you and I are in a 12-step support group, let's say we're in AA or NA,
Okay.
is that it's expected that I come in and talk about relapse. And ideally, you won't shame me for that. It's almost the only place where I can go where I won't be shamed.
Yeah.
You'll actually respect me for being honest. You'll feel sad with me, and I should feel rightfully sad, but you won't go, oh, that Bob is such a loser. And so I've been in a lot of meetings where people will talk about relapse. In fact, I'm engaged in a weekly meeting in refuge recovery where in the last few months, one of our prized members relapsed, and I don't think there was even a speed bump in that group in terms of judgment towards him. They were just welcoming arms. And I know that to be true for me, and I know the others to be true. It's almost like that group provides an oasis or a safe sanctuary to bring that.
Right.
But in general, people are not going to be happy to hear that you relapsed
Right.
if you've been in recovery. I'm going to ask you a question and me a question too right now. It's an exercise for all of our participants. Thank you, Austin. I want to invite all of you in the audience to share with Bob and Odie any comments, thoughts, and questions. And I'm going to give you an exercise right now that I would love for you to chime in with. And here's the question. Here's the next slide. I want us to ask, and you can open it up to any kind of addictive behavior. When did you resort to addictive behavior in your own life as an antidote to shame? And just to think about that for a second. Odie and I'll think about that, and if you're willing, we can talk about it. It can be to substance, it can be to behavior. Virtually all of us are addicted to certain behaviors, whether it's workaholism, overeating, undereating, various versions of sexual addiction, including pornography, gambling, spending. The list is long and really is quite endless. And so can you think of it when you've done something that you know was not good for you, you couldn't stop it, and it was in response to shame having been evoked? The example I gave was losing a job, but it could be in an interaction where you felt snubbed or hurt by somebody. Will you give yourself just a second to think about that, then Odie and I will talk about that. I'm going to pick an addictive behavior around substance, and I will talk about that. But I want to invite you to share, if you'd be willing, Odie, just
Absolutely.
an example that you have, and it's just to suggest that this is a human experience. It's not relegated to addiction per se, or certainly not substance abuse and addiction.
Okay, so I'll go on a deeper level here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So it's been probably over a year of sobriety from porn.
Good
and
for
masturbation.
You. Really respect your transparency and honor it. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
And so back then, I noticed that one of the things was I was in the middle of being unemployed and looking for work.
Right.
So I noticed that just the stress of my now wife, kind of bugging, well, not bugging, but just kind of getting on my case to look for work.
Yeah.
I noticed that was a trigger to resort to pornography and masturbation. So.
Yeah, thank you. Bless your heart for being honest. I'm going to match you in kind in terms of honesty. Really appreciate it. I said something in the group today. I said, you guys know that when we share this, there was a woman in the group talked about losing her father at a very young age. And I asked her during the break, and then I brought it back to the group. I said, did we handle that in a way that's respectful of what you shared? Because what you shared was sacred material.
Right.
And she said yes. And I brought it back to the group, and I said, it's really key to me, you guys, if I'm going to share what I am, share who I am, like you did right now, or she's going to share, or any of us, that it be held compassionately. And it's easy to, I said, if I knew that I came into group each week and you guys were going to judge me after group, soon enough that would dwindle down to where I wouldn't share myself anymore. And I said, it's really imperative that we create that for one another. And somebody in the group introduced me to a new term. There's a comment, and I'll get to that in just a second. Somebody said, Dr. Bob, we all know you're a vault.
A vault.
And I said, what's a vault? I had to think it says, we know that what you talk about here in terms of this material is that you're not going to go, you're not going to talk about it disrespectfully here, and you're not going to go blabbing about it. You're not a narc. You don't report us. Like I wouldn't leave this and go right outside. Oh, Franz, let me tell you about what Odie just said. Just it's not in my nature to do that.
Right.
We're all human, but I really appreciated that. They said you're a vault. And that's really what we're talking about, is creating a container here that's safe. And for any of you that are viewing this, I really hope that you'll hold what I share and what Odie shared the same way, as I intend to do the same with you. The irony is we won't get under shame if we don't go deep enough. You said, I'm going to take it deeper. If we don't go deep enough, you remember last week we had that image of a volcano. If you don't go down to the source of the volcano, you'll never be able to ebb the flow of the lava. And so bless you. Thank you, Odie. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm going to pause for a second, see what it says on the screen, and then I'm going to share an example myself.
Sounds good.
Somebody said, thanks, Bob, for sharing all this great information. It has really helped me. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. It helps me to have you say that. And yeah, thank you. Bless you for joining us, and thank you. We can all use positives, we can all use support, especially when we're talking about shame. In fact, kindness and compassion and loving support may be the most effective antidote to shame. If you think about shame as that you don't love me, you're going to reject me, and I suck, that's the antidote, is that this person is saying, Bob, you don't suck, and in fact, is embracing me. This person put 2 hearts up there, beating hearts. That suggests that we're cool.
Yeah.
It means a lot. I was thinking, there's no end to shame for me around this when I think about it. I was thinking all those years ago, it was 6 years ago when I got out of the hospital, which was to address my drug addiction. I got out, and the very first night out, went on a bender with a friend of mine, just got loaded with alcohol.
Yeah.
And there's lots of ways of looking at that, and there's multiple interpretations, but the one that just came to me is that going to the hospital was really my hitting bottom. I was in the hospital, and only one person came to visit me, and that meant a lot of people didn't come to visit me. It was extremely painful to me. And the fact of the matter, Odie, is I felt thoroughly ashamed of being, here I am on a hospital unit with heroin addicts, meth addicts, and me addicts. And there was something about that was very leveling for me. I don't think it was an accident that I came out of the hospital. Actually, when I was driving out of the hospital, I called my friend and asked him to set up some tequilas for us. I mean, it just gives you an idea. It was thoroughly conscious as an addict in early recovery can be, which is not that freaking conscious, but I mean, I totally set that up. I'm sure that individuals in our audience have examples of this. You're welcome to share. Whether you do or don't, it's really important that you do what Odie did, thank you, or what I'm doing right now, which is own up to this. What we're trying to do is get a bead on shame. Shame takes us over. It hijacks our brains. It hijacks our being. And if we can get the lay of the land with shame, I'm going to personify shame. Shame breeds on shame. And addiction breeds on shame as well. And so that cycle that we were talking about, if I don't get a bead on shame, I'll soon enough be using in some addictive behavior, some addictive substance, which will only lead to further shame. We've got to somehow break that cycle. And I think we start off doing that by being honest with ourselves. I came into the room today with Austin and Franz and Odie. I'm reading a book right now recommended by Austin called Crush It. It's on building a personal brand for the sake of digital marketing, about which I know nothing except what I've learned from Austin and this author. And he was talking about how it is that one of the central virtues of the successful business person is just to be transparent, to be honest. People can tell when you're feeding them a line of BS. And so start off by just being ruthlessly honest, is that people know at least they can trust you. They may not like what they hear, but they like even less not being able to trust what they're hearing. So why not start with that? So that's where we started. So thank you. Second question that I want to put out to our audience today, encourage you to share if you want to. Can you recall responding to whatever the behavior was? In your case, it was porn and masturbation. In my case, it was going out and drinking unbelievable sums of alcohol right after getting out of a treatment center for addiction, which is perverse and ironic and true. Can you recall responding to various times it's happened for you, various times? I'm only naming one instance of shame for me. Can you recall responding to that behavior itself with further shame? And so I want to ask you to think about that for a second. We'll think about that, and then let's talk a little bit about that. Because now we're getting into looking at that kind of vicious cycle, that catch-22 of shame. The thing I'm doing to resolve my shame, whether it's masturbating to porn or to downing a bunch of alcohol, itself leads to more of what caused me to do it in the first place, namely shame. So just think about that. Can you recall responding to whatever you resorted to addictively? Can you recall responding to actually with increased shame? This is great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is exactly what the doctor ordered. How about if I start and then Odie shares? Is that okay?
Good. Yeah.
I can guarantee you the next morning when I woke up from my alcohol haze, it may have even taken me 2 days to further grasp this. I realized I can still remember physically being so out of sorts with myself. I was messed up biologically because I was getting off of drugs and alcohol, so-called, and then I had just drunk a whole bunch of alcohol, which further messed with my medications and so on. And I remember waking up and just feeling like the worst feeling imaginable. And I think it wouldn't be a bad summary to say shame, and let's just talk about it. I felt like that there were people that had hope for me, particularly my partner, had hope for me going into the hospital, and I was too ashamed to even describe what I had done to her. And I was talking to my daughter on the phone as I was driving from the hospital to my friend's house. And you talk about shame. I'm talking to her as I'm leaving the hospital, knowing full well that I'm getting to that house and we're gonna start drinking tequila. It's just like, there's no way that if you have any conscience at all that that's okay. And so you can only imagine the hell that I created for myself by that behavior, which was actually designed to reduce the shame. It's paradoxical, but it's true. So that's how it went for me. Odie, do you mind reflecting or sharing?
Absolutely. So pretty much same deal, you know, knowing that it was wrong what I was doing, and my now wife knowing that I had that issue, and her asking me, you know, how are you doing?
Right.
How is it going with that? And me just kind of with a blank stare looking at her and just lying to her face.
Of course, yeah.
That added to it.
Yeah.
And then after doing what I was doing, you know, I would make these excuses in my head. Well, you know, I'm already doing it. You know, might as well just continue to do it. So, just a lot of different things that would add on top of that. Yeah. Shame.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. What Odie's talking about is true for any of us with any addictive behavior. Is that I'll lie to you in a second. The addiction will protect itself by lying about it. The way I think about it with you, Odie, I don't assume from what you said that you're a liar. I don't assume from what you said there's anything wrong with you in terms of who you really are. I don't assume the same thing about me. I actually assume I'm more judgmental of myself than I am of you. But the way I would think of addiction, I don't care if it's a behavioral addiction, you know, it's sometimes referred to as a process addiction or a substance addiction, is that addiction is subcortical. It's rooted in the pleasure center of the brain, which is right between our ears. And the problem with one of the problems with addiction is that it's not a cortical, it doesn't access the frontal cortex. And for what it does, you can look at an addict, whether I'm masturbating to porn or downing a bunch of alcohol, and the frontal cortex becomes increasingly dark. It's offline. And I'll ask my clients, I did today, I said, what does the frontal cortex go to, you guys? And they go, and one guy said, he says, it's the executive system, Dr. Bob. It's what navigates us. Another person said it's our reasoning capacity. Another person said it's my moral discernment. All of that behavior, social empathy and compassion, all of that's rooted in a fully functioning frontal cortex. Cortex is just the Latin word for bark. So our brains have bark around them, and on the insides is the subcortex, everything underneath the cortex. And what addiction does, and it doesn't matter if it's behavioral or substance, it shuts down the cortex, the frontal cortex particularly. And so we'll do the damnedest things that violate us. And in an addictive state, we can't help but do it sometimes. And then when we come out of that, for you and for me, we'll feel like crap about ourselves. Because the frontal cortex will come back online to some extent. Even for, I've asked clients before that are in deep addiction to heroin or meth, is there any part of you as you're using that's crying out, don't do this, this is wrong? And what I'm amazed by is the majority of people in any group I lead will raise their hands.
Yeah.
It may be 1%. It might be 25%. It doesn't win the day, but it doesn't go away. I'm really struck by that. And I know that experience in myself. Even when I was at the worst of my addictive behaviors, there was some part of me that knew that this was not okay, and I couldn't not do it. Could not do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or I didn't not do it. That's for damn sure.
Yeah.
So we begin to find some means of grace in this if we understand that what Odie's talking about or Bob's talking about is driven by the subcortex, is that's not truly who you are in terms of all of you,
Right.
nor of me. And I'm going to get to that in a second. Okay. I know somebody just registered something on the screen. I want to respond to this and then we'll continue on. Oh, thank you for sharing. This person said it's really in sync with what Odie and I are talking about.
Yeah.
Besides the relapse, the lying and the deception also increased the shame for me. Yeah. I mean, you don't want to lie to your wife. I don't want to lie to mine either.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is what the addictive brain does. I tend to think about it in terms of brain function just because I think the brain is kind of our seat of conscious awareness, including our conscience. Yeah. And when that's offline, we can do things that really violate our conscience. And when we come back online with our frontal cortex, we can feel awful about it. So you're absolutely right. Thank you for sharing this, participant. It's not as if the relapse wasn't bad enough in terms of this cycle. It's the lying and the deception on top of that. And virtually all of us, there are some exceptions to this, but virtually all of us are not ultimately cool with lying.
Yeah.
It comes back and bites us. So just to continue on, so we're talking about a catch-22. I hope you're getting a flavor for it. We're talking about it right now.
Yeah.
Is that I'm damned if I do. I'm damned if none of us can barbecue in our own cortisol. I can't tolerate that level of stress.
Right.
And so I'm damned by that. And then if I turn towards what one author calls tension-reducing behaviors, I can drink alcohol, we can do whatever, any behavior you can think of. We can do that to reduce the tension related to the stress response. And when I do something that helps reduce that, it actually increases it. Temporarily, it reduces it.
Right.
You know, it knocks it out temporarily. But soon enough, in come the demons of self-doubt and judgment and so on. So that's the catch-22 we're talking about. So let me ask you all a question, and Odie and me here. This addiction business is not cool. How do we put addiction on notice? That is, what can we do to get a point of leverage or traction underneath addiction? I like very much what Odie said earlier. It starts with being honest with ourselves and then finding trustworthy souls that we can be honest with. I think that's a key. But that's not enough. In fact, let me make an assertion here. My own view is that addiction takes out the best and the brightest. So I assume when I'm sitting in a room of 25 young men and women, that many of these people, I'm not assuming all of them, but many of these people have extraordinary potential and it's been stymied by their addiction. The family that wrote me last night from the East Coast and is considering having their son come for treatment at the center where I work, I've met with this man once, and it's clear to me he's had a long-term addiction, and it's clear to me that he's got oodles of intelligence and a lot of creativity, even despite that. And I'm not just saying that. It's just like it's painful to see somebody that has so much potential. I remember being in high school and I was on the basketball team. We had a basketball player. I'm not going to name him because he's probably still alive. He might not be alive. He was the most gifted basketball player of anybody out there. Yeah. And he was also the most drug addicted. Yeah. We had a basketball team that was loaded with drug use, and I was the innocent. I was just wanting to win games. This guy was so good. He was such a smooth basketball player, very talented, and he would come to the games high. Yeah. He did a combination of smoking weed before games and also dropping Seconal Reds, which is a downer. So can you imagine what it's like to be running down the court if you're on a sedative like this? It's like slow motion. Yeah. Really pissed me off that he would do that. Yeah. And it made it worse for me because he was so damn talented as a basketball player. Yeah. To make matters worse, I'm a lifelong drummer. I played music all my life. This guy had picked up a guitar. He could play guitar like Jimi Hendrix, and it was almost like natural for him to do that. It was like such a crazy waste of talent. And, you know, all these years later, I assume that probably he was growing up in an environment that was chaotic and crazy that led him to need to do that. So I don't ultimately judge him, but it makes me sick to the stomach to think of the potential that he had to offer as an athlete and as an artist. Right. And both of those were stymied. So I think of that when I sit with addicts who are struggling in the early stages of recovery. Many of them it takes getting back to what one psychiatrist calls the birthday brain, getting back to a baseline of where you have access to all this seed of your creativity.
Right.
I assume that. And even if I'm talking to a group of people that maybe aren't the brightest or aren't the best, I at least think of them as wanting to be the best and brightest they can be. And that means then we don't have to compare anymore. You may be smarter than me. It doesn't really matter. I want you to access your intelligence fully. And I want to be able to access mine. I want you to help me to do that. And in that sense, I want you to be the best that you can be. And the same for me. And addiction fouls that up massively.
Yeah.
The Eastern traditions have a phrase where they say, what's your original face before you were born, Odie? What was your original face before you were born, Bob? What was your original face before you were born, Franz? What was your original face before you were born, Austin? And all they mean by that is, what were you born to be? And the idea, it's almost like of destiny. It gets picked up in the Judeo-Christian heritage by, for example, the image of God, like the image of God in you. So there's different terminology for this. I like this idea of your original face before you were born. So this morning, as I was getting ready to go to the group, it occurred to me, I'm going to ask the group, and I introduced it to the group, I'm going to ask the group something I've never asked a group before. I came in today and I said, I want each one of you to imagine when you were 6 years old. I thought, I'm not going to say when you were younger. I want to pick 6. And I don't know why, I just picked 6. I said, it's where many of you started first grade, or thereabouts. And you can probably remember when you were 6. Some of you won't, but many of you will. Most of you will. Can you tell me what you saw as a 6-year-old? Can you tell me what you imagined for your life? What was your life like? I know that you wouldn't have had these terms for it, but can you even kind of feel into what that 6-year-old Odie or Bob had as potential as they were moving into the world as a 6-year-old? And I wasn't sure that this would fail or succeed. I wasn't sure. I was really relieved by the fact that people just didn't get up and walk out. And what people started sharing, it was really touching to me, Odie. They said, I was innocent. Yeah. Another person said, I just wanted to play. Another person said, I was open to the world. Another person said, I just wanted to play with Play-Doh. I thought that was the best response. It's like a kid of 6 years old, all other things being equal, they just want to focus on, am I going to play with bright green or bright pink Play-Doh today?
Yeah.
Love the smell of it, the feel of it. And so one person said life was just less complicated.
Yeah.
I said, as some of you in this room may have been so traumatized by the time you were 6 that you didn't experience what other people are talking about. The world was no longer uncomplicated. And somebody asked me, they said, you mean at age 6 you can have that knocked out of you? And I said, oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's where the woman that I mentioned earlier shared her experience at age 5, which I won't share the specifics of it. She shared, and I really blessed her for this, she shared an experience she had at age 5 that knocked out all innocence for her. And so there's no guarantees. It's very possible I can be a 5 or 6 year old and be profoundly depressed, be completely cut off from my feelings, be so anxious that I'm crawling out of my skin. There's no birthright, no guarantee of that. But most of the people in the room could remember a time pre-addiction where there was this kind of enthusiasm for life. Yeah. One person said, but passion, I was passionate. So I want to ask our viewers today, can you remember when you were 6 years old, or a time, I picked 6 to start with. Can you remember a time that was early enough in your life that you still have memory of it, kind of a felt sense of it? And will you take a moment right now to write down in a sentence or 2 or 3 what your original face was when you were 6? If you're willing to share, it'd be good. I'll do the same.
Okay.
Okay. There's more you can write. You can follow up today after our meeting by further journaling, and you're welcome to share it with me after our meeting today. Odie, do you want to share some first thoughts? Do you mind?
Not at all.
Thank you.
So I wrote down, and that's a really good exercise, by the way.
Thank you. I've never done it before today.
Yeah,
I'm glad.
It's interesting to kind of think back that far, if you can, and just really think like, wait, what was going on around that time? You know,
I should mention to you, the woman that I talked about said she couldn't remember when she was 6. And so I looked at her and I said, did something happen before that? And she said, yeah, this happened at age 5.
Wow.
And so it's quite possible that significant trauma can erase memory. They call it, I can't remember what they call it now. It's proactive inhibition. It erases the future, in terms of memory. So that you can remember you're 6 is a good thing, and it's not. That's not a universal.
Okay. So is that a way to like suppress certain memories?
There's so much pain that the center of our fear response is in is a little almond-shaped organ in the brain called the amygdala. Amygdala is the Latin word for almond. And it's our brain routes safety and fear through that. It's the seat of our emotional reactions that are about self-protection.
Gotcha.
And it's right adjacent to another part of the brain that's in the center of the brain, the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the center of memory. And so the one really affects the other. This, for example, is why PTSD happens, is you'll have people that are traumatized. Let's say a combat soldier is traumatized by bombs going off, comes back to the United States, is no longer deployed, here's a car backfire, and immediately is in a traumatized state, is that memory is sealed in so closely, the trauma is right there, the memory is sealed in, and so anything that even smells like that will stir a response. And so you'll get, in that case, a kind of sensitization. Anything that's like that will stir it up. The reverse is that you'll get a desensitization where you just can't remember anything. And I certainly have had clients and known individuals that have vast portions of their childhood not remembered, and that is statistically unusual. And it's virtually never without adequate reason. You just know that something awful happened, that a memory had to get erased. So it just has to do with the proximity of those brain centers. And it really is self-protection. It's almost like the brain goes into psychic shock. You know, if you get stabbed, your body will go into shock, God willing. If you get traumatized psychologically, the body goes into a kind of psychic shock, and it will numb out around that. And if that fails, you can always turn to addictions. And when I'm speaking to a group of addicts, all of us know about that, is that the number one reason most people will talk about turning to addiction to substance is to numb out. It's anesthesia. We seek self-medication. There are other reasons, but that's a primary reason. And it's all about the fact that our repression isn't working. And so traumatic stuff is coming up, for example, in relationships. All of a sudden you're losing it with your intimate other. You can't control it, and you want to chill, and so you find a way to do that with alcohol or other drugs or whatever. So, so please continue.
Okay, yeah. So I jotted down here when I was 6, my parents, they'd take time off of work, and we would hop in a car, all my siblings, so 2 sisters, 1 brother, so all 6 of us would hop in a car, travel like a week to go to Mexico, because our all of our family pretty much is down there. So just having that memory, just loving going on those road trips that were like a week, and also dreaming of being an actor slash director after watching Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, which I wasn't supposed to at the time, but...
Oh, interesting. You snuck those in.
Yeah.
Very cool. And that's age 6.
Yeah.
See how those get remembered for a lifetime?
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you. It's wonderful if you can remember those, and I am assuming you have a positive association with them. Imagine if you got shamed for watching Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. There could be the possibility of trauma around that. I'm not saying there was. They would foul that memory up. Or imagine that your family, you go up, you drive with 6 family members to Mexico. Imagine that some kind of traumatic experience happened, for example, with your parents, whether they abused you or maybe, you know, an accident, God forbid, happened or something. That stuff could get fouled up, and so it wouldn't be registered as positive memory. It might not even be remembered. But these are memories, for me, I can remember at age 6 because I was in 1st grade. I was in trouble most of 1st grade. I was in trouble. I was living in a very chaotic home environment, and I literally wasn't allowed to go to recess at some point. I had to go sit in the principal's office every recess because I always got in fights. And so the bad news is I was in fights. So by the time I was 6, things were already not going well. There were a couple of things that were going well that I think of. One is I was very curious in class. I loved learning stuff. And that was in place. That wasn't shut down. And the other thing is I certainly loved girls. My first girlfriend was Cheryl Russian. And my dad...
Cheryl.
We lived in a little small town in Southern Oregon. My dad was the only doctor for 2 counties.
Right.
And I would walk from school every day with Cheryl. I don't think we held hands, but we would walk together. And we'd walk, because I would walk to my dad's office and get picked up by my mom. And Cheryl would walk with me. And I got to go to Dee's Cafe and buy her an ice cream cone, a vanilla ice cream cone. It was a nickel. And so I remember walking with Cheryl, and I remember having a lump in my throat in first grade about Cheryl. And so, look, I remember her name. Is that crazy?
Wow.
I can remember what she looked like. I can remember how much we enjoyed those ice cream cones. We never kissed or anything. We just, that was what we did. And so there were some things that were really good there. There were some things that were already indications that Bobby's in trouble. Because what first grader spends all of first grade in the principal's office? That's not really a good sign. So
She probably liked you because you were a bad boy, too.
does it start that young? Maybe so. Maybe so.
I can picture you small with a leather jacket.
Oh, yeah.
Just getting into fight.
I have to tell you a story, Odie. I came back to this small town many years later. In fact, I was in graduate school, so probably 20 years later. I came back to this small town, and I asked about my best friend. His first name was Tony. And I was downtown, and I went to Dee's Cafe, and I asked people, and I said, "Oh, Tony." They said, "You don't know about Tony?" And I said, "No." They said, "No, he got sent to state prison." And I know that Tony was my best friend in first grade. And so that is easily my fate, you know. Right. Tony and I were accomplices, and we were always in trouble. Tony, by the way, never got to go to recesses either, the two of us, and he was my best friend. And it hits me even right now sharing that, is that at whatever age we get thrown off course, I'm not by nature a violent or aggressive person, but whatever was going on, I was acting it out, obviously. And I had a lot of love in my heart, not just for Cheryl Rush and for kids generally. And I had a lot of curiosity. There was a fair bit of intelligence, at least in potential, but it was overwhelmed by the aggression, by the reactivity.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because you mentioning that reminded me that there was this kid in our school that was a popular kid, and I always used to think that, wow, you know, I wish I was like him, like popularity. And once high school was over and whatnot, I think it was a couple of years after, or maybe more, he passed away in a car accident from he was drinking and driving and the people in the car with him were other people from school as well. So just kind of seeing that and knowing, like, okay, well, if you're on that path, you know, just where you could possibly ended up as well.
Yeah, it's very, very humbling, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that. We're going to wrap up here in the next few minutes, and I want to summarize some things. Earlier, when I looked at Odie and I said, this isn't really who you are, when we were talking about addiction, and I was saying that about myself, this isn't really who I am. This is the way that we mean it. Is who that you are at age 6 in terms of your potential, and who you are right now if you have full access to your brain and your spirit and your soul, however you understand all of that. That's who you really are. And you can get distracted, and I get distracted. Any of us can get distracted by like faulty blueprints. I had some faulty blueprints on human interaction very early on. I thought beating up people was cool. And I learned over time that that's really not cool. And I had to find a few other ways to figure this out. It took a long time to do that. But it's, in a sense, it's like looking at that original face is looking at who we really are. And it's finding a basis that's deeper than addiction. If we're talking about addiction or we're talking about shame, shame would erase your potential. It would erase my potential. It makes us defective. It makes us broken. It makes us hopeless. And what we're trying to do is restore hope here. One of the ways that I do that in the context of addiction, the next slide talks about this. How do we externalize the enemy? In other words, if I look at you and you share with me about your addictive behaviors, and I do the same with you, is there a way that we can hear each other and not assume that this encapsulates who you are? In fact, it encapsulates kind of like who you're not.
Right.
And the same for me, is that I wasn't born to be an addict, you weren't born to be an addict.
Right.
And all of us have addictive behaviors of some form or another, and it's just owning up to that. And the only way we can own up to that, if you know, and if I know, if you know that I know, that I don't look at you as being summarized by any of your behaviors. And it requires, when I say externalizing, it means that whatever you did, let's look at it objectively. And that's one of my goals about bringing in, talking about the addictive brain. Here's what addiction does to the brain. The goal is to externalize it, because I don't mix that up. I don't mix the addictive brain up with who you are, Odie. And I don't want you to do that with me. And the fact of the matter is, shame gets us really mixed up about that. It assumes that I am guilty as charged, and I should be banished, and I should feel awful about myself. And that's the end of the road, as we talked about it. Good information liberates, and we're trying to provide some good information in this series. And shame paralyzes, like what we're talking about with the freeze response, like the basketball image.
Yeah.
And so anything that I can do in the direction of externalizing addiction and looking at it objectively, that means including scientifically, that's a step in the direction of being able to separate myself from it so that I can then begin to address it. You can't address something if you don't recognize you have it, and you can't address it if you reduce yourself to being nothing but it.
Yeah.
If I don't know I have an addiction, that's a problem. And if I see myself as nothing but my addiction, that's a problem as well. So our goal here is to silence the shame. Today we talked about the way out of shame and addiction. I should have called it like a beginning way out of shame and addiction, because we're going to be looking at this in different forms for the remainder of this series. We're just coming at this from different angles. Today's is one angle where we're looking at shame in terms of looking at shame, the vicious cycle it creates, what we call the catch-22, and also looking at shame, what it does to your original self, who you really are, and to me. I'd like us to get so pissed off about shame that we actually begin to want to wage war with it. It's really not okay that shame takes away your birthright. It's not okay that it takes mine away, and that's what shame will do. Shame will make me feel bad. I will utilize addictive behavior, and then shame will remind me how bad I should feel about having used addictive behavior. And so it's a self-perpetuating cycle. Next week, what we're going to be doing is looking at getting clear on the various disguises of shame and addiction. I really appreciate you being here today, and we've talked openly about shame. The fact of the matter is, much of our shame is like an iceberg. You know, we're 10% of it's above water. Much of our shame goes unawares to ourselves, and so my shame may manifest as my being aggressive towards you. My shame may manifest as depression. My shame may manifest as grandiosity. I'm going to show off to you. And underneath is a fragile sense of self. And so we'll be looking at various disguises of shame, which is another way of saying we'll be looking at various disguises for addiction. There are certain addictions in our society, like I'll talk about masturbation and porn. As a man growing up, I've had any number of clients, and in various settings, I've been in groups where, and it's like, what's the problem with that? All guys do that. And there's a way that that's true, but just because everybody does it doesn't mean it's okay for me or for you. It depends on the individual. I don't have some kind of a judgment for all humankind around masturbation or porn, but when it serves as an antidote function to something that wants to be addressed, whether it's your shame or it makes it worse, or my shame, that's a problem. I don't assume that drinking alcohol is bad. I think if I'm doing it, obviously for self-medication, to avoid other feelings, that's problematic. That's why when I drink alcoholically. I drink addictively. 90% of people don't. I'm the 10% that do. That's a problem that needs to be addressed. So I love our being able to bring out things that are shameful, which are typically secreted away, into the open. And we're going to continue that next week. We're going to look at the other 90% of the iceberg next week.
That's good.
Do you have any final comments or questions? How's this been for you?
This has been awesome. Really glad that we were able to do this, and it's very interesting to be here with an expert and be able to be open and talk about our past, my past.
Yeah, thank you.
Issues as well, and knowing the technical side of it and practical things that people can do, and a lot of what you have said has been very vital to me being sober on that end. So
thank you for saying that.
It looks like we have. You're welcome.
Okay. I should say this. You use the word technical. Odie is part of the technical team in terms of our production team here in the studio, and so he's a man of many hats. I'm going to call him Odie/Arnie from now on. No, you're brilliant in terms of your presence here. I'd be very interested in feedback from our audience about today's presentation, because it's different in form than virtually all of our others. We had one interview some months ago, but I really value your presence, and I had no claim on how it would go. Your transparency is really a relief to me, so I really bless you for that. It's not easy to do this in any form, much less doing it on film. So you guys be honoring of what Odie shared today, or I'll come hunt you down. You hear me? Okay, thank you guys. There's one final comment that came up here. This person says, I need to stop complaining about how people behave and stop making my addicted husband as my business. Instead, I must focus on myself for my own happiness, for him to realize the impact of his illness. I really appreciate that. There's this idea in psychology of projection where I'll project my shadow onto you or you'll project it onto me. You don't have a problem. It's Bob that has a problem, or vice versa. And so one of the keys for our own well-being is to do what one author calls withdrawing the projection. And she talks about it this way. It's like a fishing line, bringing a fishing rod, bringing in the line so that you withdraw the projection onto the other person and begin to look at ourselves. And so to whatever extent we can work on this, I love this in the 12-step programs. There's AA for individuals who are wanting to heal from addiction to alcohol. There's also Al-Anon, which is family members. And the goal of Al-Anon is not to fix your, in this case, husband or partner. It's to attend to yourself. We actually call it cleaning your side of the street. And that's the most important gift that we can give to our loved ones, is make sure that we're not projecting stuff onto them, make sure that we're owning our own shadow the way you have today, and keeping that straight. So that, I totally agree with you. Thank you. It's hard to do. That's why support groups, I believe, like Al-Anon are important, because you're with people that are struggling with, how do I stop enabling my loved one? How do I stop badgering my loved one? How do I find happiness myself in hopes that my taking my loved one off the hot seat will provide some room for him or her to breathe? So I really support that. Somebody else has written in, bring shame out into the open is a way to silence it. And it's a question mark, and the answer is yes. So I'm going to remove the question mark and put an exclamation point. Is that shame wants to hide away. It wants to hide away. And as soon as we can out ourselves, and it requires safety, requires safety. We're in a safe environment here, and we're trusting you guys to hold this sacredly, is that's one of the most powerful things I can do. It's one of the strongest healing aspects of any of the self-help groups, because all of them, the expectation is you talk about the gnarliest stuff you've ever done. Yeah. So what you shared today is common currency in a self-help group. And the idea there is, if I can open myself and share it with you, and you can do the same thing without judgment, is that over time I can begin to internalize, you're not judging me and not judge myself. And so absolutely, bringing out into the open is the best way to silence it. And Austin has had 3 exclamation points. I want to thank you guys for joining. 1 exclamation point. I want to also refer you back to some resources here. We've got archived videos now in this series. This is the 25th of a series. We've been doing this for half a year, gentlemen. Blessings, France and Austin. Thank you, guys. So we've got a repository of archived material. You have today's podcast. Do us a favor and share what you saw today with friends. Share it with loved ones. Review it yourself. It's for the good of us, because the more positive attention we can have, it fuels the fire in terms of our being able to continue this series. So I really plead with you, ask you, cajole you, torture you to be able to do this. Okay, whatever it takes to get you to pass this around. Really appreciate it. Also want to encourage you to stay in dialogue with me. If you have comments you want to make to Odie, you can make it through Ask an Addiction Specialist. You can write to me, and I'll let Odie know. You can write to me at www.drbobweathers.com. There's a section there where you can contact me. Austin is actually helping me right now with my website to make it more effective. And you also can go to beginningstreatmentcenters.com for more information, and as well as to see these archives, as well as they're available on YouTube. And you can write in the comment section on YouTube. What did I forget, Austin? Covered it all. Okay. Thank you all. Blessings to you. We will come back next week, and we'll keep working on kicking the butt of shame. Thank you. Blessings. Take care. Thanks. Thank you, Odie.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.